A medieval peasant's garden was smaller than your driveway, but fed 7 people year-round. No fertilizers, no irrigation, just 10 tricks that maximized every inch. Here's what they knew that we forgot. 1. The Pottage Garden. Continuous soup harvesting. Every morning, the family cauldron hung empty over cold ashes, waiting to be filled with whatever the garden could provide that day. Peasant families built their entire gardens around one essential meal: pottage. This thick, nutritious stew kept families alive through brutal winters, but only if gardens provided constant ingredients throughout growing seasons. The concept required understanding which vegetables provided nutrition while regrowing quickly after harvest. Medieval gardeners focused on hardy crops like kale, turnips, parsnips, peas, and leeks that could be harvested continuously without killing the plant. But timing these harvests demanded botanical knowledge that took generations to perfect. Garden layout followed pottage needs rather than aesthetic preferences. Peasant families positioned quick-growing greens near their homes for daily harvesting, while root vegetables occupied more distant areas where they could develop slowly throughout seasons. The work was constant, harvesting ingredients, preparing soil, and replanting to ensure continuous food supply. Harvesting techniques allowed plants to regenerate rather than depleting garden productivity. Medieval gardeners learned to cut kale leaves from outer portions while protecting growing centers, harvest leek tops while leaving roots to regrow, and thin root vegetables to allow remaining plants space to mature. The maintenance work was demanding and never-ending. Peasant families spent hours each day tending these soup gardens, knowing that neglecting daily care meant facing winter without adequate nutrition. Failed pottage gardens often meant family starvation during months when no other food sources were available. Preservation methods ensured pottage ingredients remained available even during harsh weather that prevented fresh harvesting. Medieval families developed techniques for storing root vegetables and preserving greens that could supplement pottage during periods when gardens couldn't produce fresh ingredients. This systematic approach to garden planning created food security that meant survival versus death for medieval peasant families. 2. Turf seats with aromatic herbs. After hours of back-breaking garden work, peasants needed rest, but they couldn't afford to waste precious growing space on purely decorative features. The solution? Transform garden maintenance areas into functional seating that served multiple purposes while maximizing limited space. These weren't decorative additions. They were practical solutions that provided rest areas while growing useful plants. Construction involved building raised platforms using available stones, wooden planks, or earth berms that could support both weight and growing plants. Medieval builders created these seats along garden edges or near work areas, where families spent considerable time tending crops. Soil preparation required mixing earth compositions that would support both grass growth and human weight without becoming muddy or unstable. Peasant families learned through trial and error which soil mixtures provided adequate drainage while retaining enough moisture for plant survival. Plant selection focused on hardy aromatic herbs that could withstand occasional foot traffic while releasing pleasant scents when crushed. Medieval gardeners used chamomile, thyme, and other European herbs that thrived in compressed soil conditions while providing medicinal benefits. The construction work was labor-intensive but provided long-term benefits that justified the initial effort. Peasant families moved stones, hauled soil, and shaped earth structures that would serve multiple generations if properly maintained. Maintenance included regular trimming to prevent herbs from becoming overgrown, replacing damaged plants, and reinforcing soil structure that could erode during heavy rains or freeze-thaw cycles. The work was constant but manageable within daily garden routines. These functional seating areas provided rest spaces during long garden work days while producing useful plants that served household needs. Medieval families couldn't afford purely decorative elements. Every garden feature had to serve multiple survival purposes. The aromatic benefits provided simple pleasures that made backbreaking garden work slightly more tolerable during endless hours of cultivation necessary for family survival. 3. European companion planting, legumes and grains. Walking through medieval gardens, experienced farmers noticed something curious. Certain plants seemed to help their neighbors thrive, while others appeared to harm nearby crops. This observation led to companion planting discoveries that maximized food production from limited garden space. This knowledge developed through generations of observation about which crops thrive together versus those that seem to harm each other. The technique focused on European crops that were actually available to medieval families: peas and beans paired with barley, oats, and wheat. Legumes fix nitrogen in soil through root bacteria that medieval gardeners didn't understand scientifically but learned to utilize through practical experience. Planting patterns required precise spacing that peasant families memorized through generations of cultivation. They positioned nitrogen-fixing legumes in specific arrangements that would enrich soil for grain crops without creating competition for sunlight or water resources. Timing coordination was critical knowledge that separated successful harvests from failed experiments. Medieval gardeners learned exactly when to plant each crop to ensure proper soil enrichment, while allowing adequate growing time for both legumes and grains. The maintenance work involved monitoring plant interactions throughout growing seasons to ensure companion crops were helping rather than hindering each other. Peasant families learned to recognize signs of nutrient competition and adjust plantings accordingly. Soil management techniques included understanding how nitrogen fixation actually improved growing conditions for heavy-feeding grain crops. Medieval gardeners observed that rotating legumes and grains created soil fertility that's sustained production without external fertilizer inputs. This systematic companion planting provided both immediate food production and long-term soil improvement that sustained garden productivity across multiple growing seasons. Medieval families couldn't afford to deplete soil fertility. Their survival depended on maintaining productive growing conditions indefinitely. The knowledge represented generations of accumulated farming wisdom that meant the difference between food security and starvation for peasant communities. 4. Ash and soot pest control. The battle never ended. Slugs, snails, and insects could destroy an entire harvest within days, and peasant families had no manufactured pesticides to protect their crucial food sources. Instead, they developed organic pest control methods using materials readily available from daily life. Without manufactured pesticides, they developed organic pest control methods using materials readily available from daily life. Wood ash collection required maintaining proper fires that burned completely to white ash without leaving charcoal residue. Medieval families saved ash from cooking fires, heating fires, and other household burning, storing it in dry containers for garden use throughout growing seasons. Application techniques involved spreading thin layers around vulnerable plants to create physical barriers that deterred soft-bodied pests. Peasant gardeners learned exactly how much ash to apply. Too little provided inadequate protection, while too much could damage plants or alter soil chemistry harmfully. Soot gathering came from chimneys and fire-burning areas where incomplete combustion created fine black particles. Medieval families collected this material carefully, knowing it provided different pest control properties than wood ash while serving similar protective functions. The effectiveness came from multiple pest deterrent mechanisms that medieval gardeners observed without understanding the science involved. Ash created abrasive surfaces that damaged slug and snail bodies, while strong odors confused insects that located plants through scent. Timing applications required understanding pest behavior patterns that medieval families learned through seasonal observation. They knew when different insects were most active and applied ash barriers before pest pressure became overwhelming. Reapplication was necessary after rains washed away protective barriers or when wind dispersed ash layers. Medieval gardeners maintained constant vigilance, reapplying pest deterrents as frequently as daily during peak pest seasons when crop destruction could mean family starvation. This organic pest management provided essential crop protection using only household waste materials that required no external purchases or special preparation. 5. Pigeon manure, concentrated fertilizer. In medieval hierarchy, pigeon-keeping families held a distinct advantage over their neighbors. Those who could maintain pigeons possessed access to exceptionally rich fertilizer that dramatically improved garden productivity, a privilege that could mean survival during harsh years. Pigeon keeping wasn't recreational. It was an essential survival strategy that provided meat, eggs, and valuable soil amendment. Pigeon housing construction required building dovecotes or simple structures that encouraged birds to roost while allowing easy manure collection. Medieval builders used stone, wood, or clay to create nesting areas positioned to maximize manure gathering without disturbing breeding birds. Collection techniques involved systematic manure gathering that didn't interfere with pigeon productivity. Peasant families learned to clean roosting areas regularly while maintaining conditions that kept birds healthy and encouraged continued nesting in designated locations. Application methods required understanding that fresh pigeon manure was too concentrated for direct plant contact and could burn roots or foliage. Medieval gardeners learned to age manure properly or mix it with other materials to create balanced fertilizer that enriched soil without damaging plants. The fertilizer's potency came from high nitrogen content that provided exceptional plant nutrition compared to other animal manures available to peasant families. But this concentration demanded careful application knowledge that medieval gardeners developed through costly trial and error. Storage and aging required proper techniques that prevented valuable manure from decomposing uselessly or creating sanitation problems near family living areas. Peasant families built storage systems that preserved fertilizer value while preventing odor and pest issues. Timing applications to coincide with plant growth cycles maximized fertilizer effectiveness while preventing waste of precious soil amendment. Medieval gardeners learned exactly when different crops needed nutrition boosts that pigeon manure could provide most effectively. This concentrated fertilizer source could dramatically increase garden yields when properly managed, making pigeon-keeping families significantly more food secure than those depending solely on other fertilizer sources. 6. Nettle liquid fertilizer. What most people considered a painful garden nuisance, clever peasants recognized as free fertilizer waiting to be harvested. Stinging nettles, abundant throughout European countryside, could be transformed into powerful liquid fertilizer that boosted plant growth significantly. This technique turned a common weed into valuable garden resource that cost nothing but labor to produce. Nettle collection required protective techniques that medieval gatherers developed to avoid painful stings while harvesting maximum plant material. They learned to cut nettles before flowering when nutrient content was highest, wearing thick gloves or using tools to handle plants safely. Preparation involved fermenting chopped nettles in water containers for several weeks until plant material decomposed into nutrient-rich liquid. Medieval families used wooden barrels, clay pots, or other available containers, covering fermenting mixtures to prevent evaporation while allowing gas escape. The fermentation process created strong-smelling liquid that indicated proper decomposition was occurring. Peasant families learned to judge fermentation progress by odor, color changes, and decomposition levels that showed when fertilizer was ready for garden application. Application techniques involved diluting concentrated nettle liquid with additional water to prevent burning plants with overly strong fertilizer. Medieval gardeners learned proper dilution ratios through experience, knowing that incorrect concentrations could damage rather than help garden plants. Storage methods preserved liquid fertilizer for use throughout growing seasons when fresh nettle collection wasn't practical. Peasant families developed techniques for keeping fermented fertilizer from spoiling while maintaining its nutritional value for plant feeding. The fertilizer's effectiveness came from high nitrogen content and other nutrients that nettles accumulated during growth. Medieval gardeners observed dramatic plant growth improvements when using nettle fertilizer compared to plants receiving no soil amendments. This free fertilizer source allowed peasant families to improve garden productivity without purchasing expensive amendments that were beyond their economic means. 7. Seasonal planting calendar. There were no second chances in medieval agriculture. Plant too early and frost killed seedlings. Plant too late and crops failed to mature before winter. Survival demanded rigid seasonal schedules that determined planting, harvesting, and garden maintenance activities. These weren't suggestions. They were survival requirements that meant food security versus starvation during harsh winters. Calendar knowledge was memorized. Oral tradition passed between generations since most peasant families couldn't read written agricultural guides. They learned to recognize seasonal signs like daylight length, temperature patterns, and natural indicators that determined optimal timing for different garden activities. Spring preparations began with soil preparation that had to be completed before optimal planting windows closed. Medieval gardeners worked frantically during brief periods when soil was workable but not waterlogged, knowing that missed timing could delay plantings by weeks. Summer maintenance followed strict schedules for cultivation, harvesting, and preservation activities that couldn't be postponed without risking food security. Peasant families worked from dawn to dusk during peak growing seasons, knowing that neglected gardens meant winter starvation. Fall activities included harvest timing that required careful coordination to gather crops at peak nutrition while ensuring adequate storage for winter survival. Medieval families had to complete all harvesting before weather conditions made fieldwork impossible. Winter planning involved seed saving, tool maintenance, and garden preparation activities that ensured readiness for the following growing season. Peasant families spent winter months preparing for spring planting that would determine next year's food security. Weather prediction relied on natural observation skills that medieval farmers developed through lifelong experience with local climate patterns. They learned to read cloud formations, wind changes, and animal behavior that indicated weather changes affecting garden work. This systematic seasonal approach ensured maximum garden productivity while preventing timing mistakes that could result in crop failures and family starvation. 8. Wattle fencing and living hedges. A single goat wandering into the garden could destroy months of backbreaking work in minutes. Protection wasn't optional. Crop losses to animals could mean family death during winter months. This reality drove peasants to master fencing techniques using locally available materials. Garden protection wasn't optional. Crop losses to animals could mean family death during winter months. Wattle construction involved weaving flexible branches between wooden stakes to create barriers that kept livestock and wild animals away from vulnerable plants. Medieval builders used willow, hazel, or other bendable wood that could be woven tightly enough to prevent animal intrusion. The building process required significant labor investment, but used materials that peasant families could gather from local forests without purchasing expensive manufactured fencing. They learned to select proper wood types that would remain flexible during weaving while becoming rigid when dried. Living hedge creation involved planting thorny or dense-growing shrubs that formed natural barriers as they matured. Medieval gardeners used hawthorn, blackthorn, and other native species that provided protection while potentially producing edible berries or useful materials. Maintenance work included regular repairs to wattle fencing that could be damaged by weather, animals, or normal wear. Peasant families constantly replaced broken sections, rewove loose areas, and reinforced weak points that could allow animal intrusion. Hedge management required pruning and shaping that encouraged dense growth while preventing hedges from overshadowing garden plants. Medieval gardeners learned techniques for maintaining living barriers that provided protection without competing for soil nutrients or sunlight. Multi-purpose design allowed fencing systems to serve additional functions like windbreaks, privacy screens, or support structures for climbing plants. Peasant families couldn't afford single-purpose garden features. Every element had to provide multiple survival benefits. These protective systems ensured garden security using sustainable techniques that could be maintained indefinitely without external resource purchases. 9. Seed-saving techniques. No seed merchants existed in medieval villages. When harvest ended, peasant families faced a crucial decision: eat every last grain or save some for next year's planting. This choice between immediate hunger and future starvation made seed saving essential survival skill. Seed saving was essential survival skill that determined whether families could continue food production. Selection criteria focused on identifying the healthiest, most productive plants that would pass superior traits to offspring. Medieval gardeners learned to choose seed plants based on disease resistance, yield, and survival characteristics that provided best chances for successful future harvests. Harvesting timing required understanding exactly when seeds reached optimal maturity for collection. Peasant families learned to recognize proper seed development stages for different plants, knowing that premature or overripe seeds often failed to germinate the following year. processing techniques involved cleaning, drying, and preparing seeds for long-term storage that would preserve viability through winter months until spring planting. Medieval families developed methods for removing seed coats, eliminating debris, and ensuring adequate drying that prevented spoilage. Storage methods protected valuable seeds from moisture, insects, and rodents that could destroy next year's planting material. Peasant families used clay pots, wooden containers, or cloth bags positioned in dry locations where seeds remained viable until needed. Testing procedures helped medieval gardeners determine which saved seeds remained viable after winter storage. They learned to test small quantities before committing entire garden areas to potentially failed seed lots that wouldn't germinate. Documentation relied on memory and simple marking systems since most peasant families couldn't write detailed records. They developed techniques for tracking seed sources, ages, and performance that guided future selection decisions. This seed independence provided food security that couldn't be disrupted by external supply failures or economic problems that prevented seed purchases. 10. Forest garden integration. Gardens alone weren't enough. Even the most productive plots couldn't provide complete nutrition year-round, forcing peasants to look beyond their boundaries for supplemental food sources. The surrounding forest became an extension of their survival strategy. This forest gardening provided crucial nutrition during periods when domestic gardens couldn't meet family needs. Foraging knowledge required understanding which wild plants provided safe, nutritious food versus those that could cause illness or death. Medieval families memorized detailed information about edible plants, learning to identify useful species while avoiding dangerous lookalikes that could poison entire families. Tree management involved maintaining wild fruit and nut trees that provided seasonal food sources without requiring garden space. Peasant families learned pruning and care techniques that improved wild tree productivity while ensuring continued harvests for future years. Seasonal coordination timed wild food collection to coincide with garden production gaps that left families vulnerable to food shortages. Medieval foragers knew exactly when different wild foods became available and planned collection activities accordingly. Preservation techniques extended wild food availability beyond natural harvest periods through drying, fermentation, and storage methods that maintained nutrition while preventing spoilage. Peasant families processed wild foods using same preservation techniques they applied to garden produce. Integration planning combined wild and domestic food sources into comprehensive nutrition strategies that provided complete dietary needs throughout yearly cycles. Medieval families calculated food requirements and planned both garden production and wild collection to ensure adequate nutrition. Territory management involved maintaining access to productive wild areas while respecting community boundaries that determined which families could harvest from specific locations. Peasant communities developed systems for sharing wild food resources without depleting natural productivity. This forest integration provided food security buffer that could sustain families during garden failures that would otherwise result in starvation. These 10 garden tricks weren't weekend hobbies. They were survival techniques that required extensive knowledge, back-breaking labor, and daily attention throughout growing seasons. Medieval peasant families developed them because failed gardens meant watching loved ones starve during brutal winters. The work was exhausting and constant. Building fences, fermenting fertilizers, and maintaining seed stocks consumed enormous amounts of time and energy that modern gardeners rarely consider. Many families failed despite knowing these techniques because the physical demands exceeded their capabilities during difficult years. Yet these methods represent remarkable human adaptation to harsh survival conditions. Medieval peasants couldn't visit stores when gardens failed. They had to make small plots provide complete family nutrition using only local materials and accumulated wisdom. If these medieval garden innovations fascinated you, subscribe for more explorations of practical skills our ancestors mastered. Which technique surprised you most? Share your thoughts below, because understanding how medieval families fed themselves reminds us how much agricultural knowledge we've gained and lost over centuries.